Today we're going to talk about continuation betting, or as I like to say, it's all about the equities. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Exceptional Poker Video. Today we're going to talk about continuation betting. This is a topic that Sky Matsuhashi over on Smart Poker Study has been covering the last couple of weeks. Really good set of podcasts on it, and I'm going to put a link below in the YouTube description. So if you're interested, go check that out. It's really worthwhile. Um, Anyway, I wanted to maybe expand a little bit on it. I've got my own sort of theory about how to determine whether and when to continuation bet. And I think that this might be something worth you watching and picking up. This is something that was one of those aha moments for me a while ago. I blogged about this. Again, I'll put the links to my blog articles on continuation betting below as well. Um, but this is really something useful, I think, to help sort of wrap your head around the more theoretical look at continuation betting and continuation betting as a function of pot equity and fold equity. So um, before we do that, though, we need to actually answer the question, what is a continuation bet? I think you all know, but I'm going to say it anyway. A continuation bet is also known as a C bet. Both terms are used to describe the same thing. And what it is a bet, a flop bet, a bet on the flop from a player who was the pre-flop aggressor. That is the last person to raise or bet pre-flop. When that person bets on the flop, they have continued, quote unquote, continued to maintain the initiative in the hand or the aggression in the hand, and hence the term continuation bet. And a common misconception about continuation bets is that they're only for bluffs. They're only when you whiff the flop, and that's when you continuation bet. That's wrong. Continuation bet is simply you are the pre-flop aggressor, and now you're going to go ahead and bet again on the flop. For value, you've got a very strong hand, for example, and you want worse hands to come along. As a bluff, meaning you whiff the flop, but you think you can get better hands to fold if you bet, or perhaps somewhere in between, such as a semi-bluff. You've got a draw, you've got overcards to the board, something like that. You've got a backdoor flush draw, something along those lines. And so you're betting somewhere in between a value bet and a bluff bet. In other words, a semi-bluff. You wouldn't mind if everybody folded, but if they don't, you still have outs to improve. Any one of these things can be a continuation bet, and that's the first key point. Continuation bets are not just bluffs; they're more than that. Okay, now I'm going to give you an example of continuation bet just to kind of drive that point home. In this particular hand, we are the hero, bugged on the button in a 1-2 game. Everybody's got $200 stacks. Blinds are 1-2. And as the action unfolds, you'll see we will be continuation betting on the flop. So there's a couple of folds, the seat 8, seat 9, and seat 1s all fold. And then the villain in mid position raises to $6. It then folds to us on the button. We have ace king offsuit, and we make it $16 to go. The blinds fold, action folds back around to the villain, who elects to just call the $10. Flop comes out as dry as you can imagine. Queen 7 deuce rainbow. The villain checks to us, checks to the raiser. We fire a bet of $24, and then the villain folds. So we're betting in this particular case as a semi-bluff, kind of erring on the, or edging towards the bluff period side. And what we're doing here is we're firing a bet, and we're more than happy when the villain folds, which he does. But if he were to continue, we'd still have some outs. Any ace, any king probably is a winning hand for us. So that's kind of a prototypical continuation bet. We were the pre-flop aggressor, meaning the last person to put in a bet or a raise. And then when check 2 on the flop, we went ahead and bet. Continuation betting 101. Okay, so that's a continuation bet. Now let's talk about how we decide when to continuation bet. And in order to do that, we've got to talk about something called the expected value equation. You're probably familiar with this. And if you're not, then you absolutely need to learn about EV, or expected value. Expected value is the gambler's equation, and it's what every successful gambler, including all successful poker players, kind of do, whether they know it or not. But this is really what they're doing. They're trying to maximize this equation. And the equation is EV, or expected value, is equal to the probability that you're going to win in a situation multiplied by the amount you're going to win, minus the probability you're going to lose that particular situation multiplied by the amount that you stand to lose in that situation. So, for example, if you're on a draw and there's a probability you're going to make your hand multiplied by the pot, the amount of money that you're possibly going to win. And from that, you subtract the probability you're not going to make your hand, which is usually a bigger probability, multiplied by the amount that you're going to lose, which is the amount you're going to call, which is a small figure. And as long as this value is positive, in other words, the left side of the equation, the part that's probability of winning times the amount won, is larger than the right side of the equation, the probability that you're going to lose that situation multiplied by the amount you're going to lose, then EV is positive, and it's a good call. There's lots of examples of in poker of maximizing EV, and everything we do in poker is centered on the EV equation. Okay, how does this help us with c betting? Well, let's stop for a minute and remember the two ways that we can win a poker hand. Remember, there's two and only two ways that we can win any given hand of poker. Number one, the most obvious, is we can show down the best hand on the river. We can have a better hand than our opponent. That's called our hand equity or our pot equity, sometimes called PE. The other way we can win a poker hand is we can bet and force everyone else to fold. We bet, everyone else folds. And this is related to another equity term called your fold equity or situational fold equity, or FE for short. Now, pot equity is, technically speaking, it's the share of the pot that is owed to you on average in this situation. And that's sort of the technically correct term for pot equity. The technically incorrect, but way that it's used often, and the way we're going to use it in this discussion, which is fine, is pot equity is equal to the probability that our hand will win at showdown. Now, it's not exactly that, of course, but we're going to use the term that way. So if we have high pot equity, it means our hand is relatively strong against our opponent's range of cards. So there's a very good probability that our hand is going to be best at showdown. Aces against two random undercards is typically something like 85% pot equity. And you can think of that as the aces are going to hold up roughly 85% of the time if you were to run that out hot and cold to the river and get to showdown. Now, fold equity is a little bit different. Fold equity is, again, it's from a technical point of view, it has to do with the share of the current pot that is owed to us if we bet with the expectation that everybody is going to fold. The incorrect, technically incorrect, but useful way to think of fold equity is that it's the approximate probability that we can get everyone else to fold if we bet. It's the likelihood everyone else is going to fold if we make a bluff bet or a bet into the pot. So these two terms, pot equity and fold equity, are the things that are used to maximize, if you will, this part up here in the expected value equation. If we have big pot equity, there's a very good chance our hand is going to be best at the showdown. So that part of the probability of winning is going to go up. Similarly, if we have high fold equity, then it means that that part of the equation can also be bigger because there's a very good chance that if we bet, everyone's going to fold, and therefore we're going to win the hand. So these two factors, pot equity and fold equity, are really fundamental inputs, if you will, into the expected value equation. Okay, so this is it written again. This is the expected value equation written in terms of fold equity and pot equity. And I'm not expecting you to learn this or memorize this or even really read it in great detail. But effectively what we're saying is that the continuation bet expected value is a function of fold equity multiplied by the current pot plus 1 minus the fold equity times the pot equity times the pot minus 1 minus the pot equity times the bet, yada, yada. Basically what it's saying is that the bigger our fold equity and or the bigger our pot equity, the more likely we're going to win, and therefore the higher the expected value of continuation betting. So in a sense, everything we do in continuation betting is related back to these two terms, the pot equity we have in the given situation and the fold equity we have in the given situation. Um, and so therefore, your very first task to determining whether you should continuation bet or not is to actually estimate what these two equities are, estimate what your pot equity is, and estimate what your fold equity is. So let's look at pot equity first. Pot equity is a function of two factors. One, your hand, the two cards that have been dealt to you in Texas Hold'em, and two, the range that you put your opponents on. Okay, I can hear you complaining right now. This means that yes, you actually have to be able to hand read, at least to some level of skill or some level of ability. You have to be able to put your opponents on a range. If you can't do that, you can't really estimate what your pot equity is. And again, this is the wrong format or the wrong lecture to talk about hand reading. And there's a lot of good YouTube videos out there and some good reference materials on this that you can Google and find out about. But basically, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to compare our hand against the range we put our opponent on. And the tool we use to do that once we put our opponent on a range is something called an equity calculator. There's lots of different ones out there. Flopzilla is a very popular one. Equilab is another. I'm a Mac guy. I use an Apple computer, so Flopzilla and Equilab really aren't available to me. I use something called Poker Cruncher, and this is a screenshot here of a poker cruncher situation. In this particular hand, we have Jack 10 suited. Our opponent has sort of an early position, taggy opening range, eights plus, ace 10 suited plus, king jack suited plus, and ace queen suited plus, ace queen off plus, I'm sorry. So against that range, our Jack 10 off on this particular board of a Queen 7 deuce rainbow board, we have pot equity of only roughly between 14 and 15%, 14.68%. So we don't have a lot of pot equity in this situation, which is kind of understandable. If we put our opponent on this sort of a range, on this very dry board, our Jack 10 is very weak and is only going to win at showdown if all the money went in at this point about 15% of the time, which is not very much, but this is how you calculate pot equity. And that's the first step, the first equity that we calculate, and that's how we do it. The second factor, fold equity, is a little bit trickier to estimate, and it's really actually hard to nail down an exact number for fold equity. With pot equity, we can, if we do a pretty good range analysis and put our villain on a pretty tight range, a pretty good range, we can run an equity calculator and get a pretty good estimate on our pot equity. Fold equity is a little squishier in terms of if we're using it as an approximation for the probability that we're going to get folds if we bet. So the way we do this is there's lots of factors that go into this. And I've listed the 8 most popular or important here. There are other factors depending upon the situation that you're in that might also come into play, but these are 8 of the most important that you really should kind of think through in your head as you're sitting there trying to decide whether you should continuation bet on a flop or not. First, and by far the most important thing, is the number of villains you face. The more villains that are in the hand that have seen a flop with you, the lower your fold equity, or the lower the probability you have that a bet of yours is going to make everybody fold. And the reason for that is obvious. The more villains there are, the more likelihood or probability that at least one of them has hit the flop, that they've got a piece of it and aren't going to go away if you bet. If there's only one villain, you have higher fold equity versus if there's 2 villains. All other things being equal. If there's 3 or 4 or 5 villains in the hand, you typically have very little fold equity in that situation. So number of villains is really important. That's sort of the first thing you have to look at. The next thing is what kind of types of villains are these? Calling stations, for example, players that get sticky, want to see flops and want to see other cards, or sheriffs, meaning players that just don't believe you and want to keep you quote unquote honest Against these kind of players, you typically have pretty low fold equity. They're not going to fold to a single continuation bet on the flop. In contrast, players like nits, very nitty, tight players who are playing a fit or fold approach to poker, um, are going to miss the flop 2 out of 3 times on average, about 65% of the time, which means when they miss, they're going to fold to a continuation bet of yours. So the type of villain is really important. And so you've got to pay attention to um, what kind of opponents you're up against. Are they calling stations and loose passive, no fold 'em, hold 'em types, or are they nitty rocks and they're nut hunting and folding to everything else? Those are two very different situations. The third thing is kind of an obvious one as well, and this is the board texture. What cards come out on the flop, um, and and how did these cards hit your opponent's range? Um, Wet boards, boards that are very coordinated, um, that have two or three cards to a suit or are connected in a straight kind of fashion, especially boards that are in the upper ranges from like nines up through aces. These kind of cards hit a lot of your villain's ranges typically. But again, you've got to put your opponent on a range and then evaluate the board texture relative to the range. So wet boards and boards that hit your opponent's range, obviously you have lower fold equity because it's more likely to have connected with your opponent, and therefore it's less likely he or she's going to fold if you bet, if you make a continuation bet. So wet boards, connected boards, boards that hit your opponent's range mean low fold equity. Dry boards like that Queen 7 deuce example we saw, rainbow, that don't really hit your typical opponent's range, you have generally much higher fold equity. So you've got to look at board texture. The fourth factor is actually two factors, 2 parts, stack and pot sizes. Shorter stacks, meaning if there's a shorter effective stack at play here, then there's lower fold equity. And what I mean by that is, let's say we're in a situation heads up with a villain, and we're pretty deep. We have 100 big blinds, but he's only got 20 big blinds. Um, this means that the SPR, stack to pot ratio, on the flop is going to be relatively low typically, depending upon how big the pre-flop raises were, which means that the villain feels more pot committed typically to continuing and not folding to a bet. And that's actually a correct play. Typically, if you're shorter stacked and SPRs are small, stack to pot ratios are small, um, the there's usually pot commitment in play here. Sorry, a giant bug just flew by. um, Pot commitment is in play, which means they're not going to fold to your bets, which means you have lower fold equity. Deeper stacks, big deep stacks, people are much more wary of losing big amounts of their stack and risking big amounts. So bigger stacks, 100 big blinds or so, you typically have much higher fold equity than against short stacks. Similarly, the size of the pot matters as well. Big pots often mean lower fold equity because there's more reward, if you will, to stick around and see another card, is how a lot of villains think about it. They often think that that they've got money invested in the pot and they're not going anywhere, so there's lower fold equity on bigger pots. If the pot is small, many villains think of that as, well, this is not worth fighting over. So you have much higher fold equity than if the pot is big and juicy, and and they're seeing dollar signs in their eyes and they want to take that pot down. So stack and pot sizes are important. The next factor is the actual continuation bet size itself. Typically, bigger bets put more pressure on your opponent. So in general, you get higher fold equity with the bigger bets. The flip side or downside of that is that you're risking more. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but typically speaking, the bigger your c-bet size, the higher the fold equity. Another factor is pre-flop action. If the villain was aggressive pre-flop and then you re-raised him or her and then they called, that's a different situation than if they just limped into the pot, you raised and they called. Bart Hansen likes to call this the aggressive action theorem. And what he means by that is a villain who has been aggressive pre-flop tends to be stickier on flops than somebody who was more passive and limped in or cold called a raise or something like that. So Pre-flop aggression from the villain typically means lower fold equity. They're less likely to fold. The next to last bullet point here is the hero's image. This is a really important one. If you have an image at the table, assuming that your opponents are paying attention, because at the micros and low stakes, often players are bad and they're not really paying that much attention. But assuming that your opponents are paying attention and you've been caught bluffing in the past, or you have an image of being very loose and splashy and overly aggressive and involved in lots of hands, and you've shown down pretty weak hands on previous hands, you're going to have lower fold equity. Your opponents aren't going to believe you when you bet. They're going to think, oh, this guy's full of it again, and they're less likely to fold to your bet. On the other hand, if your image is that of a tight rock-like opponent, and they've only seen you shown down monsters, and you've been folding the last 30 minutes in a row and haven't played a hand, you typically, and they're paying attention to that again, you're going to have much higher fold equity. They're going to be much more likely to fold if you bet. And then the last factor is something that's very important as well, and this is position. Typically, if you're out of position, you're going to have lower fold equity than if you're in position. And this is just one of those statistical things that falls out of poker. If you look at the numbers, it kind of makes sense because when you're in position, you've got more information and you can make better decisions and see, oh, okay, he's checked to me, my opponent's checked to me. I'm going to take a stab at this, and they understand that they're going to be out of position if they call. Or if they continue in the hand, so they're less likely to stick around. So your position matters greatly as well. Be more inclined to see that as a bluff, as an example, when you're going to have position or you have position on the flop than if you don't. Okay, so now that we have pot equity and fold equity, we can plot them in an XY grid where along the X bottom portion, a horizontal part of the graph going from left to right is our situational fold equity, ranging from 0% to 100%. And similarly, pot equity, we can plot in a vertical axis, the Y-axis going from the lower left to the upper left. And this is our pot equity ranging from 0% at the bottom, meaning we have no chance of our hand holding up and being the best at showdown, ranging to 100%, meaning we have the nuts, we have the best possible hand, and we cannot be beaten. And then the range in between. So let's look a little more closely at each one of these. Okay, so let's look at pot equity. Pot equity again ranges from 0% at the bottom kind of bands of the chart on up to 100%. So when we have strong value hands all the way up to the nuts, we're sort of in the top region of this graph. When we have nothing, when we have air, when we have extremely weak hands, we're in the bottom part of this graph. And when we have hands that are in between, for example, medium showdown value hands, draws, these kind of hands, we're living in the middle of this thing. So this is important to keep in mind, and you'll see why in a minute. Now let's look at fold equity. Okay, similarly, fold equity ranges from 0% on the left to 100% on the right. And what this means is on the far left, the villains effectively can't be bluffed. They will not fold if we bet for whatever reason. Their calling stations or your image is so bad that they're just not going to fold, or any one of those 8 factors that result in low fold equity. This results in you being in this left side of the graph. Conversely, on the right side is where villains can be bluffed. This is your image is very good, you have position, you bet large, there's only one villain. All of those factors that we saw previously come into play here. And when they result in high fold equity, you kind of are on this vertical band on the right side of the graph. And then in between are all the sort of middling situations when you've got some fold equity in sort of mixed bag. So you might have, you're up against one opponent, but he's more of a calling station, but you have a good image. So it's sort of somewhere in between here. And we'll see why this is important in the next chart. Okay, so we have our XY grid, situational fold equity, on the bottom axis going from left to right, pot equity on the vertical axis going from 0% up to 100%. What's interesting about this is we can now determine whether or not we should continuation bet and why. And let's look at that next. Okay, so if we're in, say, a situation where we have high pot equity, meaning we have a very strong hand, and we have very low fold equity, meaning our villains are not likely at all to fold to a continuation bet, then we're in the upper left-hand corner. It's a high PE, low FE situation. And what this means is we should continuation bet as for pure value, and we should bet as large as we possibly can because we have very strong cards and our opponents aren't going to fold. So in this particular situation, when we're in the upper left-hand corner of the grid here, we're betting as continuation betting on flops for value, and you want to bet again large. The opposite side of this graph in the lower right-hand corner is when we have very little pot equity. We have a really bad hand relative to our opponent's range, but we have very high fold equity, meaning that they're very timid players or they're or what have you. But whatever it is that's caused the situation that we have very large or very high situational fold equity, meaning we can bet even with no hand strength at all, and there's a very good likelihood our opponents are going to fold. For example, a very dry board against a nitty player might mean we whiff the flop, but we know our opponent did too, and we know he's a fit or fold kind of player, so he's most likely missed the flop. We can bet almost 100% of the time in that situation and take it down. So in this particular case, we're continuation betting as a bluff, as a pure bluff, in fact, because we have no pot equity. And in this particular case, we should bet more on the small side. Unlike in the upper left-hand corner of this grid, when we're betting for pure value, we want to bet large. Down here, we want to bet more on the smaller side because we want to risk less. There's no sense risking more if the likelihood of our opponent folding is so high. And in the middle here is where things get a little bit squishier, but again, we can sort of determine things. If we have moderate pot equity and moderate fold equity, we probably should be c-betting for value plus a protection factor, if you will. Or we're c-betting as a semi-bluff. Maybe we have a lot of outs, for example. So in the middle here, anywhere along this diagonal from the upper left to the lower right, if you find yourself anywhere on this diagonal, you should be continuation betting. And again, the further up you are to the left, the more it is for value, and the further you are down to the right, the more it is as bluff, and then somewhere in between there. Okay, fine. But how does this, what happens to the other quadrants if you're not on that diagonal? I'm sorry, that diagonal here. What happens if you have very low pot equity and low fold equity? Well, this is a very simple answer, actually. You should not be continuation betting here. You should be checking and folding here. You have no pot equity, meaning your hand is garbage. It's air. It has very little, if no, showdown value at all. And you have very low fold equity, meaning your opponents just aren't going anywhere. There's 3 or 4 of them. You have, you have a terrible image. The board is very wet. All of those kind of factors that result in a low fold equity puts you down in this lower left-hand corner. And down here, there's no reason to c-bet. You cannot get a better hand to fold, nor can you get worse hands to call. So in this particular zone of this grid, you should just be checking and then folding. C-betting is negative EV in this particular situation. The flip side is the upper right-hand corner of the grid. Up here, you have very high pot equity and very high fold equity. So let's say you flop the nut flush. You've got ace X of hearts, and the board comes out all hearts. And so you have the best possible hand, but you also have very high fold equity. You've got a fit or fold opponent. You have a very tight image. All those kind of factors. The board is wet but misses your opponent's range. So you have very high fold equity and high pot equity. This is one of the rare situations in poker that I recommend that you consider slow playing. I'm not saying you necessarily should, but you really should consider slow playing when you're up here. You know, you flop quads, for example. Betting is going to most likely chase out a nitty player from the pot. You don't want them. You don't want that. You want them to catch up. So in that particular case, checking back on the flop might make the most sense. You can't get worse hands to call in this particular situation, so you should not be c betting. And that's really it. This is how you determine whether you should continuation bet and why you're continuation betting. You calculate your pot equity by looking at your hand strength relative to the range you put your opponent on. That tells you where you are in a vertical sense on the graph. Then you evaluate your fold equity, and that tells you where you are on a horizontal sense. And where those two pot equity and fold equity points intersect puts you somewhere in this chart. And for the most part, you should kind of follow this. If you're in the middle band, running from the upper left to the lower right, if you're anywhere up in that area, you should be anywhere along that area, you should be continuation betting most of the time. If, however, you're in the quadrants here, the low PE, low FE area, or the high PE and high FE area, um, there's you should not be c betting because you either can't get better hands to fold or worse hands to call effectively. So c betting is negative EV in those particular situations. Okay, so let's just sum this short video up and get you on your way. So continuation betting should be a significant part of your game. This is the first point. If you kind of look at the area, if you will, in that grid, roughly 75% of that grid area, that big band through the middle, um, is when you should be c betting. So on average, you'll be c betting about 75% of the time. Now this doesn't mean you should strive to bet 75% of the time. No, what I'm trying to say by this is if you do the analysis correctly and properly evaluate your PE and your FE, your pot equity and fold equity, and find where you are on this grid, you'll find that you'll be doing c bets about 75% of the time after 100,000 hands of poker or something crazy like that. That's really what you should be doing. But really, the step is you have to make this determination. You've got to evaluate pot equity and you've got to evaluate fold equity. Or else you can't actually determine whether you should continuation or bet. If you can't determine a reason to bet, if you can't say, I'm in the upper left-hand corner of this pot, so I'm c betting here for value, or I'm right smack in the middle with a multi-out draw against an opponent I might be able to push off if I bet. So I'm betting as a semi-bluff, or I'm in the lower left-hand corner with really pot equity, real low pot equity and real fold equity. If you can't actually find a reason why you should or shouldn't c bet, then you should just not. Or more to the point, if you can't find yourself somewhere on that band, that diagonal somewhere in the middle of the chart, just don't c bet. Don't continuation bet. And the next point here kind of emphasizes that. So these two factors are basically the entirety of continuation betting, what it's based on. It's pot equity, which is your relative hand strength. Again, requires you to have the ability to put your villain on a hand range. And your fold equity. And again, there's a number of factors. Those 8 that I listed earlier are really the most important that you should be considering. And as you get better, there's more factors that come into play. There's metagame stuff and whether somebody's tilting or not and all that kind of stuff. There's other factors, but those 8 are really the real key starting point. So in summary, do not continuation bet if both the fold equity and pot equity are low, meaning you're in the lower left-hand corner of the grid. Do continuation bet if the fold equity or pot equity is medium to high, meaning you're somewhere along that diagonal area in the middle. And consider slow playing if both of your pot equity and fold equity numbers are high, if you're in that upper right-hand corner of the grid. And that's really all there is to c betting, guys. It kind of looks simple when you plot it this way, and it kind of is actually. The trick, the devil's in the details, as it is in most things in poker. You have to be able to hand read. You've got to be able to make these estimates and actually think think things through. You should not be c-betting just because you're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to on the flop. You should not be c-betting because you didn't c-bet the last two times and now you think you should this third time around. Those aren't valid reasons to continuation bet. You have to bet as a reason, for a reason. You've got to know the why in poker. And if you don't, you shouldn't be c-betting. It's that simple. Anyway, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you guys paying attention and tuning in. Leave me a comment if you want to add to the discussion in the box below. Give us a like, or even better, it'd be great if you subscribed here on the YouTube channel to Exceptional Poker, the channel. YouTube's algorithms look for subscribers and likes and those things, and that gives me a little bit more visibility if you do that. Plus, as I put out new videos, you'll hear about them first, and you'll be able to see them right away. So thanks again for joining us, and I'll talk to you next time. Cheers.